Good afternoon. My name is Paul Ryer, and I am the Director of Scholar Programs here at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Welcome to our Fall Colloquium series, or welcome back if you've been attending. Special thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for sponsoring the fellowship that brings Clint to campus this year. Dr. Klinton Burgio-Ericson holds a PhD from the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a PhD in art history. He comes to us from a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Anthropology. And he's here for the year working on a project titled In the Celestial City and the Middle Place, Cultural Negotiations in 17th-Century New Mexico Missions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Klinton Burgio-Ericson. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Paul. I'm speaking today from the campus of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm a guest on these traditional Tewa lands known as the White Shell Water Place. This greater region is home to other Pueblo, Apache, and Dene peoples as well, and I've been deeply blessed by the honor of living and working in this vibrant nexus of Native arts and people today. I especially want to acknowledge the acquaintances, collaborators, students, and friends who have patiently shared their perspectives and challenged me both as a professional and as a person. Today, I want to reflect on storytelling as a form of interpretation. Storytelling is both an act of meeting an audience where they are and an art of keeping them in suspense. Often, a story's true contours only become evident in its conclusion, in the twist that reframes everything. Yet in the fraught landscape of colonialism and its ongoing reverberations today, the ending often reveals not one story, but many. Take the destruction of the Purísima Concepción, a mission at Hawikku Pueblo in western New Mexico. This was a Spanish Franciscan establishment on the outskirts of a Zuni Indian town, itself on the margins of the Spanish Empire of the 17th century. Alternatively, it was right in the heart of the lands which the Shiwi or Zuni people have cared for since time immemorial, close to their middle place of the terrestrial realm in nearby Halona or present-day Zuni Pueblo. Hawikku sat roughly 12 miles to the southwest, near to what is now the state line with Arizona. Hopi Pueblos, including Oraibi, Walpi, and Awadabi, are located to the west, while Acoma Pueblo lay to the east. Other pueblos were situated up and down the Rio Grande Valley and its surrounding mountain ranges. Here we see Hawikku as it appears today. The mission residence, or convento, once lay in the foreground, while alignments of earth and stone at center mark the deteriorating walls of the single-nave mission church. Rubble from ancestral Zuni houses covers the high ground of the ridge behind, cross-cut by modern interpretation trails. These ruined conditions require an interdisciplinary approach to better understand the artistic contributions of ancestral Zuni people and Spanish colonizers. The site of the Purísima Concepción was contested ground long before the establishment of the mission. In 1539, the first contact between Spanish and Pueblo cultures occurred when an enslaved North African named Esteban arrived as an advance scout, and Zunis killed him in a first strike against colonialism. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado and his expedition of at least 1,500 soldiers and indigenous Mexican allies got to Hawikku the following year, attacking and occupying the town, killing 60-some of its defenders, and then moving on to the central Rio Grande Valley. While other Spanish sporadically appeared, it was not until 1629 that Franciscans arrived to establish a mission in a Hawikku house that they appropriated on the edge of the settlement. This arrangement was short-lived, however, when resident priest Francisco Letrado exhausted Hawikku's patience 3 years later, disrupting Zuni religious observations and demanding that they attend Mass instead. The friar dead and their little convento burned, missionaries would not return to the town until the mid-17th century, building and staffing the formal establishment that would meet its own end barely 2 decades later. The story then goes like this. In the midst of a desperate famine affecting all of the peoples of the arid Colorado Plateau, a party of Apache warriors attacked the mission where it stood on the outskirts of the town. This was probably a morning raid, purportedly on October 7, 1672, a day when many of the Pueblo's men were working far away, leaving the mission and town vulnerable. Finding the resident priest, Pedro de Ayala, inside the church clutching a cross and image of the Virgin Mary, the attackers dragged him out into the churchyard, stripping him of his liturgical garments and killing him at the foot of the standing cross. These events took on a symbolic resonance as the warriors pelted the priest with hundreds of stones and arrows, laid out several dead lambs alongside him, and delivered a killing blow by crushing his skull with the church's heavy bronze bell. They had effectively cut out the mission's anthropomorphic tongue, turning it into a weapon to silence its other colonizing voice, the resident friar himself. The people of Hawikku did not escape either. According to various sources, the raiders also killed women and children from the town, as well as taking others captive and burning houses and supplies. This scene of devastation greeted returning Zuni farmers later in the day, and Fray Juan Galdo, missionary to the neighboring town of Helona, when he arrived on the scene. It is his description that Spanish Franciscan chroniclers later recorded. A different storyteller, a different story. Today, Zuni people live together at the Helona site, where middle village structures retain the spatial form and scale of the old town, while juxtaposing aspects of local building traditions with industrial materials. Clan houses and kivas surround the open dance plazas next to the much altered and deteriorating Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe Mission Church, a structure hearkening back to 17th century missionization. Zuni oral histories recount their contrasting collective memory of Spanish occupation and coerced evangelization. Some families today emphasize the importance of remembering the trauma of their ancestors, while others focus instead on transmitting more positive aspects of history to avoid carrying anger and negativity into the future. Spanish occupation and missionization remain a dark chapter in Zuni history, and when storytellers touch upon it, they do so from a Zuni perspective. For instance, when the late Kaikwimosi, or head rain priest, Mikalita Witsalusi, recounted the destruction of the Hawikku mission, he focused on the lives of two Zuni women who lived there. One, the wife of a non-celibate Catholic priest, and the other her sister. In Witsalusi's telling, the priest did not die as a courageous martyr, but rather as a coward, fleeing the scene, and ultimately killed when the Apaches caught him and threw him down from the rooftop of the church. A summary end to a peripheral antagonist. Instead, Witsalusi emphasized Zuni agency in his story, with members of the Hawikku priesthood colluding with the Apaches to plan the raid, and much of the telling focusing on the resilience and survival of the kidnapped wife, who eventually escapes her captors and through great difficulty makes her way back to Zuni territory and resettles with Hawikku survivors at the neighboring site of Kechibawa. These are not irreconcilable stories, but rather reveal very different perspectives on Spanish colonization. Yet because Spanish perspectives were written down with the illusion of permanence and objectivity, theirs became the primary vision of New Mexico's colonial missions, which entered the popular imagination of the early 20th century, and which still shapes many people's understandings of this history. Rarely do these renditions of pious padres, alone in their simple, impoverished frontier missions, acknowledge the coerced indigenous labor that formed complex, heterogeneous households in each convento, much less Native women living and working alongside the friars, such as the wife and hero of Witsalusi's story, nor the real and threatened violence, labor demands that exhausted and starved Pueblo families, indoctrination of children, and forced suppression of their religion, all of which cloud memories of this time for descendants. Why do I present this history as competing stories? When I first came to New Mexico during my undergraduate studies, I was amazed by the complex cultural layers sedimented across the arid landscapes and art of this place. Later, when I visited Zuni Pueblo looking for research topics, I was likewise humbled by the accretion of stories and deep importance of the Hawikku site for so many people, as one of the few places marking initial encounters between Native peoples and European colonizers in what we now call the country of the United States. Hawikku is home to generations of Zuni ancestors and the lives they shared together. It is a key landmark in the history of New Mexico and in the development of American anthropology. It is a place reverberating in meaning, but yet little known to the general public. As a writer trained in art history, I seek to tell a story that is both responsible to the diverse evidences of the past, in material, textual, and oral form, but also to consider the implications of this narrative for who we are today and how we will use this knowledge. Ultimately, what is art history, but a form of storytelling, disciplined by the material remains of the past and oriented towards creating different futures. To describe these renditions of the past as stories is not to make light of them, but rather to take seriously the responsibility of the telling and trying to understand its meaning for those who have the greatest vested interest. I'm thankful for all of the insights that I have gained through collaborative partnerships in Zuni and amongst museums and archives across the country, as well as to SAR, for the time and mental space to think through some of the implications of this work and attend to the craft of writing. What I'm going to present today, then, will be an outline for the telling of a story. Instead of a close scholarly argument moving point by point through the various evidences that I have presented elsewhere, I will summarize 4 key components of a good story and how I see them in my own writing. These elements will be the setting, rhetoric, characters, and plot. Through discussion of these elements, the contours of possible stories will begin to emerge, but be forewarned. At the end of the day, their ultimate resolution may remain evasive, both because my research is ongoing, but because there is no way to fully account for all possible narratives within the frame of one story. The multifold nature and innumerable perspectives entangled in the past will always generate diverse and contested accountings in its futures. Setting. Setting describes the temporal and geographic environment in which a narrative occurs, and is in essence the means by which a story becomes possible. Within the context of my narrative, the setting is Hawikku Pueblo and its mission. The remains of the town sit on a low promontory at the center of this photograph, overlooking the sweeping valley of the Plumasano Wash that drains west into the Zuni River. Zuni accounts describe the emergence of their ancestors from the underworld in the bottom of the Grand Canyon and their gradual migrations through the southwest, seeking a home at the world's middle place, acquiring cultural institutions and leaving traces such as Hawikku's ruins across the landscape, which remain sacred to Zuni descendants today. Archaeologists believe that the town was one of a handful of Zuni ancestral settlements along the river valley by at least 1400. At the time of Spanish arrival, the adjoined housing blocks around irregular plazas spread out over the hilltop, with mud-plastered walls and flat, packed earth roofs rising in terraces as high as 4 or 5 stories. 19th century photographs of Zuni Pueblo give some sense of what Hawikku might have looked like, with ladders providing access to the rooftops, where hatchways led into individual living quarters below. Traditionally, Western Pueblo societies have been matrilineal, with clearly gendered but complementary divisions of labor. Women owned houses and crops while conducting work related to the female-gendered earth, such as building and plastering adobe walls or making pottery. Men moved to the houses of their wives and undertook labors and religious responsibilities outside the homes in ceremonial kivas and beyond the town, where they hunted, farmed, and gathered resources. The material culture, foodways, and practices of ancestral Zuni communities formed a set of interlocking, mutually dependent technologies. Rooftop hatchways provided access and security through retractable ladders, while facilitating the ventilation of smoke from hearths in rectangular pits set in the floors below. These slab-lined fireplaces corresponded to floor-based cooking and dining practices, while round-bottomed ceramics fit the narrow fireboxes, pot rests, and adobe benches. This coherent system of accommodating forms and practices expressed Zuni cultural values and the subordination of individual family members to the collective household unit as they dined out of a shared pot, scooping up the porridges, gruels, and stews typical of a diet based on corn, beans, squash, wild game, and gathered plants. Ethnographic accounts suggest that domestic spaces encoded aspects of Zuni cosmology, such as the conception of the world as layered, with 4 cardinal directions to the terrestrial level, and a central axis extending from the skies to the underworld, connecting the various levels. Similar to the semi-subterranean kivas of Pueblo religious societies, Hawikku's domestic spaces evoked this layered cosmology, with the sunken fireplaces conceptually set in the underworld, and the ladder reaching for the sky and ancestral spirits. Ethnographically recorded prayers frequently use the phrase ladder descending children to describe Zunis in general, placing them in relation to the spirits outside the home, whom their prayers address. The ladder therefore carries cosmological implications, and their exaggerated prominence, often with terraced, cloud-shaped finials on top, suggested a symbolic significance beyond mere utility. These were architectural features distinctive of Colonial Pueblo in the 19th century, like antennas probing the Zuni skyline. Spanish descriptions and ethnographic comparisons indicate Zuni towns were governed by groups of elder religious leaders and complementary clan mothers. Although their cultural institutions proved resilient, the pressures of colonization generated factional conflict. Coronado's early expedition left behind many Christianized Indians from Mexico, as they opted to stay and become part of Zuni society rather than return to the social constraints of the Spanish-controlled towns of their origin. These native people could speak Spanish, were baptized with Christian names, and they and their descendants became a key resource for later Spanish occupiers. Although Zunis largely resisted colonization, throughout the historic record, there remain traces of a pro-Spanish faction that saw strategic benefit in accommodating the missionaries, and which may have contributed significantly to the indigenous core of mission households. Franciscan living quarters, or conventos, are another key setting of this story, usually comprising quadrangular and closed structures attached to the church, as we see here at Hawikku Pueblo, the only pre-revolt convento to survive largely intact. The Franciscans held a monopoly on evangelization in New Mexico and were an active mendicant order, without the vows of seclusion characteristic of monastic orders such as the Benedictines, for whom an enclosed cloister around an open patio or garden was the center of conventual life. In contrast, Franciscan friars lived an unsettled life as, quote, pilgrims and strangers in the world, attempting what they thought was a literal imitation of Christ. Nonetheless, in practice, Franciscan conventual houses often adopted the architectural form of a cloistered plan like those of monastic predecessors, which became semi-public spaces where prominent laity could meet with the brethren to share meals and devotions. In the Americas, indigenous workers met the mission's staffing needs, with as many as 30 to 40 native laborers in each pre-revolt mission in New Mexico. They filled a variety of roles, including gatekeepers, bell ringers, interpreters, household servants, woodcutters, gardeners, and herdsmen. For liturgical activities, there were head and subordinate sacristans, musicians, altar boys, and singers. Women worked as cooks, corn grinders, and water carriers. While some may have only reported to the mission periodically, others lived full-time within pre-revolt conventos, together with Spanish missionaries. I describe these groupings of people as mission households, heterogeneous collectives of Spanish and Pueblo men, women, and children, linked by their common connection to the labor and functions of the mission. As other studies of household archaeology have shown, such collectives are bonded primarily by function as productive units, often characterized by tension, oppression, and even outright violence among inmates. It is my contention that this fraught social setting of the heterogeneous mission household is an essential consideration for interpreting mission architecture and material culture. Their social context cannot simply be overlooked or denied. Hawiku's Purísima Concepción completes our discussion of setting by providing a concrete case study and material evidence for what actually happened in a particular mission household. While the first missionaries arrived in 1629, its formal structure was not built until the mid-17th century and was destroyed not long thereafter in 1672. In the early 20th century, ethnologist in charge at Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, Frederick Webb Hodge, took an interest in Hawikku. With sponsorship from the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation, he oversaw the Hendricks Hodge archaeological expedition from 1917 to 1923, with the mission itself excavated in 1919. Careful analysis of the notes and photographs from this work has allowed me to distill the structural history of the Hawikku mission as it was designed and changed over time. These excavations were motivated by rapid acquisition of museum specimens, and the late and incomplete adoption of then-emergent archaeological techniques limited the value of Hodge's data. But they also represented a monumental early American archaeological endeavor and produced a critically important museum collection of thousands of items, now part of the National Museum of the American Indian. Hodge's work was not without opposition, however, and Zuni community members resisted his excavation and removal of 1,000 ancestral burials. Letters written by Zunis at the time, which came to light through my research, demonstrate that the tribe did not give permission for this work. Rather, Hodge exploited political factions within the community and threatened to have the site removed from the Zuni reservation, forcing compliance with his wishes. Rhetoric. As the art of persuasion, rhetoric typically describes an element of written or spoken discourse, and as such it plays an important role in storytelling, seeking to convince an audience of the urgency, relevance, and interest of a narrative as it unfolds. At another level, architecture and material culture often encode their makers' rhetorical positions in ways that subtly shape the activities and experiences of users. Franciscans used architectural form and style rhetorically to convey information about how they saw themselves, or their identity, and their place within the spatial and temporal world, their cosmology, expressive practices which continued in 17th century New Mexico. Take the original plans of the Zuni missions at Hawikku and Halona. They are so nearly identical that they must have been laid out by the same designer or based upon a common design. They are not merely functional complexes. Their form and arrangement conveys clear ideas about how the missionaries saw themselves. Each exhibits a single nave church with a rectangular or polygonal apse for the altar and a large atrium or churchyard in front. To the southeast, their conventos comprised square arrangements of enclosed rooms and ambulatory hallways around open-air patios. The adjoining of these quadrangular living quarters and churches expressed the distinct realms of everyday life and sacred ritual that were united in early modern religiosity. The enclosed outer walls and inward-facing integration of the convento symbolically represented the mission community as a household, but also enforced it in practice. The monumental size and internal space of the church expressed the transcendence of worship, seeking to unify the congregation before the altar. Both missions share a rare intercardinal orientation, with their apse towards the southwest, which only appears in a few other places. As Gene Friedman at the University of Missouri-Kansas City first pointed out, and I arrived at independently, these missions appear to be oriented to the summer solstice sunrise. In 2017, I was able to observe this relationship in person and confirm that the rising sun would likely have shone directly down the nave, illuminating the original altar. Since Zunis mark the summer solstice with careful observations, ceremony, pilgrimages, and dances, it seems unlikely that this unusual orientation was accidental, and its repetition at both sites makes the intentionality clear. Whether this was an attempt by Franciscan missionaries to co-opt local religious observations, or a canny manipulation by Zuni builders to maintain a connection to traditional beliefs amidst the imposed religion is not clear, and perhaps both can be true. In any case, the mission's orientation connects them to the larger landscape and expresses a relationship to indigenous practices deeply embedded in these specific places. Even though the Franciscans did not practice cloistered seclusion, the architectural form of rooms enclosing an open patio garden lived on amongst their conventual houses. For example, the Gothic-style cloister at Cáceres in Extremadura, or the Mudéjar cloister, with horseshoe arches at La Rábida in Andalusia. This form offers certain functional benefits, controlling access while allowing maximum spatial integration, lighting, and ventilation. But its symbolism was even more important. For medieval Franciscans, who initially struggled to distinguish themselves from other lay groups, adopting the cloister rhetorically conveyed a sense of establishment within the greater church. Cloister-formed conventual houses legitimized the Franciscans by association with monastic precedents, dignifying what had begun as an unconsolidated group of itinerant preachers. Cloister-formed conventos remained prominent among the 17th century missions of New Mexico, while Franciscans developed other options in Spanish Florida, Texas, and California. The fact that every known 17th century New Mexico mission incorporated a cloister-planned residence, sometimes going to great trouble to adapt it to poorly suited sites, indicates that it retained crucial symbolic and rhetorical significance among the pueblos. The cloister form was a dense signifier of the Christian worldview at the heart of the religious community, structuring a meditation on humanity's fall, on salvation through Mary and Christ, and on the anticipated apocalyptic victory of Christianity embodied in the celestial city at the end of time. The walled-in quadripartite patio was open to the sky and metaphorically to heaven, making these enclosed gardens apt allegories for the Virgin Mary and her reception of God's light in the form of the Christ child. Fountains or trees at their centers symbolize the means by which Christians believed mankind could access divinity through baptism and the cross, forming an axis mundi, or central point where heaven and earth connect. Eden, at the start of the world, was believed to have been an enclosed quadripartite garden with 4 rivers springing from the tree of knowledge of good and evil at its center. Terrestrial Jerusalem was seen as pivotal in bringing about this future transformation, and it too was idealized as a walled, circular or square quadripartite space with 4 main gates at the center of the terrestrial realm. As medieval theologians thought about it, the cloister was a potent symbol of Christian cosmology, and a structure for meditation on the fall of mankind, the means of salvation through Mary and Christ, and the anticipated triumph at the end of time. How did New Mexico's missionaries think about this architectural form? None of them wrote their thoughts down directly, but analysis of their larger rhetoric shows representations ranging from millenarian evocations of cosmic struggle, imagining the Pueblos as direct extensions of the Christian Holy Land, to a more pragmatic approach, hoping to cooperate with the Spanish civil government in recreating orderly monastic landscapes like that of Iberia. Within this range of possibilities, the cloister form's evocation of Jerusalem and monastic precedents were equally resonant, reassuring Spanish officials while alluding to some of the more radical and millenarian visions that persisted among the missionaries. In both cases, the architectural form represented an attempt to remake Pueblo landscapes and people according to the cosmological conceptions of the missionaries. Representing these outposts as orderly Spanish religious establishments masked a complex lived reality within the heterogeneous convento households. Character. Compelling characters are a point of entry for an engaging narrative, inspiring passion and empathy, making the story relatable. We have already met several rather flat characters associated with the Hawikku mission. Fray Juan Galdo, who inventoried it in 1672 and returned after its destruction soon thereafter. Or Padre Pedro de Ayala, who attempted to die as a martyr in front of the altar, but survived long enough to be killed for real in its atrium instead. As an art historian from the school of New Materialism, I would argue that our characters need not be constrained to human persons, however. The objects in this story also become agents in its telling, worthy of our attention. The statue of the Virgin. She whispers her reassurances to the pious martyr until he is ripped from her arms. The renegade bell. It tolls in its final fierce abandon as it smashes his skull. The toppled cross. It meekly hides the genitals of his broken corpse in embarrassed modesty. A theoretical recognition of the agency of artifacts concords with persistent indigenous philosophical perspectives, which see ancestral objects in museum collections as living traces of ancestral presence. Likewise, from an archaeological perspective, the artifacts comprising Hawikku's legacy collections represent direct traces of life and events at the site. The material characters are essentially storytellers in their own rights, their surfaces, workmanship, and damage bearing witnesses to the lives of makers and users, if only we knew how to read them. What to make out of the distinctively indigenous craftsmanship of artifacts from the Mission Church? The glaze-painted bowl from the altar steps, with its bold pattern of abstracted frets along diagonals, forming the stepped pyramids of rain clouds in their negative space. Or the unpainted baptismal font, made in the form of an enlarged Hopi bread bowl, complete with the strawberry-orange blush that potters today interpret as a mark of the pot's liveliness, like a warmly blushing human face. What about the carefully ground rectangular sandstone slab with a pile of artifacts in front of the altar, still bearing the stains of a picture frame burnt on top? Are these traces of Padre Pedro's martyrdom scene? Or were they thrown down and broken by the Apache attackers, seeking to subvert the altar's symbolism? What did the priests think of this apparent altar stone, so different from conventional versions inset with holy relics and inscribed crosses? Or the mica that once glittered from the carefully carved, lapped, and inlaid surface of the picture frame? What did Pueblo craftsmen and craftswomen think of these objects during their laborious manufacture? Some material characters speak their parts more clearly. A group of grinding stones known as metates and a hammerstone from the convento ambulatory testify to the presence of women working in the heart of the mission living spaces. Grinding corn and wheat were daily tasks, and female millers and bakers are regularly mentioned in colonial documents. The maul was likely used for pecking rough new surfaces on the metate, resharpening it for continued use. Even though the mission had a designated grinding room, these artifacts from the main corridor indicate that we ought to imagine the resident friar stepping around native women working at food production as he went through his daily routine. In addition to the sound of bells and liturgical chanting, the mission soundscape comprised the noise of grindstones and the voices of women working together in the course of daily life. Connecting oral history to the artifact assemblage, we might wonder if these were the tools of the priest's wife and sister, as Witsalusi describes them, and whether they had been at work grinding the day's flour for tortillas at the very moment of the mission's attack. Other characters speak to mission household cuisine. Broken fragments of greased griddle stones were found in the kitchen, much like those Pueblo women used to produce the crispy corn wafer bread known as piki among the Hopi and dohewe and Zuni. This double griddle is likely among them, with two small 10-inch burners that were smaller in size than the typical Heiwe stone, but perfect for producing tortillas. These stones were part of a kitchen complex combining four differently sized fireboxes with adobe partitions to form raised cooking surfaces and pot rests and a wide hearth against the back wall. A platform in front allowed women to squat beside their fires, continuing familiar floor-level cooking. The mission kitchen adopted other aspects of traditional Zuni domestic spaces. Its adobe benches, narrow storage bin, and floor-level work surface yield a space with significant Zuni characteristics, but adapted in scale to feeding more people and combined with Spanish introductions, such as a smoke hood and a raised cooking station. Altogether, these features remind us of the agency of Native women cooks in adapting the space to fit familiar embodied practices and culinary techniques. Reliance upon traditional Pueblo cuisine and Zuni cooks thus reshaped elements of the convento through their presence. Other features hint at mission cuisine incorporating numerous indigenous elements that would have clashed with European sensibilities and nutritional concerns at this time. Missionaries may have controlled the overt religious activities in the church, but the materials and practices of everyday life allowed for expression of a Zuni vernacular and insinuated aspects of Pueblo cosmology in their midst. Regardless of Spanish attitudes, Native cooks and diners had their own associations with Zuni cuisine as products of their upbringing in Hawikku households. Strongly connected to memories of taste, smell, and touch, these experiences likely introduced concepts of Zuni religion and worldview into the convento through the minds of its household members. Dohewe, for example, was a religiously significant part of ceremonial feasts. When mission cooks prepared it, and when Native members of the household bit into the crispy bread, it is unlikely that they could have avoided memories, expectations, and taste rooted in their childhood experiences, largely beyond the priest's knowledge. These everyday materials and often non-reflexive choices or habits were a significant factor in reshaping convento life. As characters in the drama of accommodation and resistance, culinary materials and tools became complicating protagonists in relationship to the missionary programs. Plot. Plot is conventionally understood as a sequence of events driving storytelling, moving hearers from conflict through a climax towards resolution in the end of the story. Real life rarely follows this linear trajectory, and the actual past was an infinite entangling of individual lives, suggesting that the secondary subversive sense of the word plot might also be a meaningful inflection. The historian grapples with myriads of perspectives. The protagonist of one person's story might be the antagonist of another's, in which the organizing principle may be a form of resistance or plotting against rather than accommodation. Take mealtime in the convento. Primary sources note that mission households gathered in the refectory or antechamber of the friar's cell for devotions prior to sharing an evening meal together. Descriptions suggest that friars adopted a metaphor of the ecclesiological family, with themselves in the paternal role, overseeing meals served in individual portions employing soup plates of imported majolica as well as locally produced versions. The soup plate was part of Euro-American social systems, table comportment, and concepts of individualism. The circumference of the wide rim presented flexible gripping possibilities, allowing multi-directional exchanges rather than the direct hand-to-hand contact of traditional Zuni labels. In other words, they were better suited to inequitable social contexts, such as a server placing food on a table in front of diners. The bowl of the soup plate individualized portions, and the form was easily carried from the kitchen to the refectory, allowing eating far from the hearth and separating spaces of production and consumption. Plating food facilitated its movement away from the female sphere of the mission kitchen to the convento's more masculine gendered spaces of dining, allowing friars to present themselves as padres, generously providing for the physical and spiritual nourishment of their mission households, even though they did little to no cooking themselves. Close inspection of Pueblo-produced soup plates and other tablewares shows that Native artists exercised creative agency in transforming foreign shapes and decorative motifs into complex new intercultural artifacts, sometimes called colonial wares or colonial wares. I use the term culturally hybrid ceramics to describe these artifacts. Among the most notable features of the Hawikku assemblage were many pieces of San Bernardo wares, a type of ceramics produced among the Hopi mesas using coil building techniques, traditional pigments, and the distinctive fine-grained yellow-firing Hopi clays, combined with forms of Spanish introduction such as soup plates, cups with annular rings, apothecary jars, and salt cellars. The Hopi women making these items emulated Majolica forms, such as the flat bases and flaring rims of these soup plates, but they translated their source material into a Hopi idiom. They organized the painted rims with black bars radiating to the four terrestrial directions and filled the space between with Pueblo symbols, including the stepped terraces of rain clouds, cruciform dragonflies, checkerboard and diamond symbols of water, ears of corn, feathered prayer sticks, and many other indigenous motifs. In 2019, I was privileged to work with Hopi and Hopi Tewa potters from First Mesa among the collections of ancestral pottery at Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History and National Museum of the American Indian. When conversations turned to discussing Hawikku's hybrid ceramics, these artists affirmed that the fragmentary vessels were made from local clays and pigments characteristic of their traditions. They could identify specific motifs, such as black-tipped eagle feathers, against a solid red ground, symbolizing the hard male rain of summer thunderstorms, or red dots, symbolizing the soft drizzling of female rain. The bowl of another soup plate, with a painted image of a chicken or water bird at left, appears to have been based on designs characteristic of a polychrome majolica. Many sherds of this imported majolica ware appeared at Hawikku and other New Mexico sites, with colorful animals, scrolls, dots, and leaves, lending the style a playful quality. Contemporary First Mesa artists again affirmed the Hopi craftsmanship of this piece, using local materials and a thin yucca brush to execute the detailed painting. At the same time, the artists countered that such vessels were, quote, not Hopi, culturally speaking, even though the artists clearly used Hopi materials and techniques. The bird does not exhibit the same style of Hopi painted feathers, for example, but rather copies foreign sources, such as the feathers of a reused abo polychrome bead from Hawikku. These were items existing somewhere in between cultures, being part of the experiences of the heterogeneous mission household and drawing on multiple frames of meaning. In one particularly striking example, the artist of a conical San Bernardo salt cellar adopted a form that probably had roots in Asian porcelain and Mexican majolica, painting its sides with four arching motifs on a ground line reminiscent of Hopi kiva murals. Two of these arches formed radiant niches, sheltering equilateral crosses that also evoke four-pointed stars, a symbol associated with warriors and protection in both Pueblo and Dene or Navajo ancestral rock art. The alternating arched motifs translate the design of Spanish bobbin lace, an ornament that began appearing on Pueblo polychrome majolica from Mexico in the 1660s. Whereas other Hopi artists translated these fanning lace motifs and thick blue lines fairly directly, with the substitution of local red pigments for cobalt blue, the artist of the Salt Cellar transformed them more radically. She created new motifs of arching rainbows, complete with the black and white band characteristic of Pueblo rainbow designs, with feathers or prayer sticks behind them. Rounded black-tipped eagle feathers appear on one side, and pairs of flat-tipped turkey feathers on the other side. Salt was itself a powerful symbolic material. In the tradition of European Catholicism, it represented God's grace at the dining table, and was also an important element in the rite of the catechumen, in which converts ate a pinch of salt before baptism. It was thus the first sacramental food that believers received, and salt cellars remained important heirlooms and works of art in early modern Europe. Salt's divine symbolism had parallels in Pueblo thought. For example, Zunis understood salt to be the body of the salt woman or salt mother, a personified being who helps to preserve human health and who lives at the Zuni Salt Lake. The salt cellar came from the storage closet of the mission sacristy, adding questions about its meaning and use. Was it a sacramental vessel in storage, or a tableware hidden away in a dark closet, perhaps because its symbolism too strongly evoked Pueblo religious concepts. The fact that either is possible points to the complicated intertwining of rituals and connotations pertaining to convento dining tables and liturgical tables of the church altar as twin facets of mission life. Among Hawiku's finest artistic objects, the Salt Cellar raises many unanswered questions, but clearly represents an infusion of Pueblo ideas and imagery into the mission context. The result was a sophisticated work of intercultural art, entangling European Christianity and native Pueblo cultural expressions far more expansive than what one would expect from such a small object. The narrative plot embodied in this work, and others like the painted soup plates, diverges depending upon the perspective and cultural conditioning of the interpreter, speaking of different meanings to different users. Unfamiliar with the indigenous implications of this iconography, Spanish missionaries likely would have interpreted hybrid ceramics according to their own familiar cultural background, seeing the plates as reassuring evidence for assimilation to, if not full competency in, Spanish cultural norms. Their form spoke to the adoption of European dining conventions, while the painted ornament imperfectly emulated Majolica models. In contrast, Pueblo users living and working in the mission likely would have seen aspects of their traditional worldview and domestic artistic languages in these elements, confirming a cosmos organized around the centrality of their pueblos and the essentially intertwined reciprocal relations of human beings and non-human persons. The remains of Hawikku Pueblo, and particularly the Purísima Concepción, furnish a rich but complicated ground for interdisciplinary storytelling. As a setting, they are a context for exploring indigenous survivance and wider colonial social dynamics within a particular concrete case study. The mission's built environment communicated key rhetorical tropes expressing missionary ideals, while the individual material characters occupying these spaces speak to indigenous artistry and creativity, as well as visible aspects of Pueblo culture within the everyday spaces of the mission household. Together, these objects speak of the entangled plot lines of divergent narrative trajectories and their subversions. The rejection of the mission and Franciscan campaign of evangelization ultimately speaks to a very different story than what the priests and chroniclers had hoped to tell. And so we come back to storytelling, ending right where I'd forewarned, with multiple, irresolvable narratives pushing against any simplistic linear plot, or even a coherent setting. The missions of New Mexico in all their complexity pertain equally to Native American, Latin American, and, quote, American histories, as well as those of the global early modern period, Franciscanism, gender, agency, bodies, and cuisine, among other potential trajectories. The entangled visual vocabularies of the Salt Cellar and soup plates, or the accumulated traces manifest in a site such as the Halona Mission Church, may speak more eloquently than settled masterpieces of art historical canons to the contested issues of a heterogeneous amalgamation of people, nations, ethnicities, and cultures comprising what we aspirationally call the United States. The most difficult part of writing this history is finding an adequate means to frankly acknowledge the trauma and violence of colonialism while still honoring the lives and agency of the people who experienced it and the meaning they sought to make out of their worlds. I find storytelling to be helpful in wrestling with these issues by engaging the imagination in both understanding the complexities of the lived past and groping towards the realization of different futures. These are living histories, with repercussions that echo on in the lives of people and places today. We see these in the contestation of monuments to colonizers and ongoing calls for more indigenous control over material heritage in museum collections. I began my talk with a land acknowledgement, and I think now it is time to acknowledge that such pieties may be meaningful but insufficient. Acknowledgement carries the burden of moral response as we learn to live in better relations to the indigenous lands where we are, but also to listen to voices advocating for land back, the return of indigenous lands to the control of caretakers whom we purport to recognize in such statements. And with that unsettling challenge, amidst these many unsettled stories, I'll end my talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Clint. That was a wonderful talk. I have lots and lots of thoughts and questions. I'll try to start with other folks, but one quick observation. came to mind with thinking about the beautiful complexities you showed us with the salt cellars, especially. And it made me think of a line, one of my favorite lines in social thinking from Roland Barthes, who once wrote, meaning is like a grace that descends upon the object. Maybe in this case, meanings are like graces that descend upon the object, because you're looking at so many multiple meanings, and just beautiful. So thank you. So for folks just joining us or joined a little bit late, again, I'm Paul Reier. I'm the director of scholar programs here at SAR. I'm trained as an anthropologist from Chicago, and we are hoping for questions. We have a few here. I see, I had asked, and I'll ask again, if you could put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can. Please don't use the chat function. I think our staff will move those over. So we have about 5 questions. Let me see what we've got so far. And folks, please continue to put questions in as we have a quick conversation. Clint, you have enough time. We have about 15 minutes till the hour, but 10 minutes till the hour. But if you don't mind going a little over, is that right?
Sure, I'm happy to chat as long as people want to ask me questions.
Okay, terrific. Our first question is from Ramon Gutierrez, and I believe professor at the University of Chicago. Hello, Ramon. How many Franciscan friars were at Hawikku at any one time during the Christianization process, and how many indigenous residents?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. The missions in New Mexico were habitually understaffed. They never reached their full allotment of 60-some friars. And Hawikku, being kind of on the margins of the colony, was usually only had one friar, if any. In 1672, right before it was destroyed, Fray Juan Galdo wrote an inventory of materials both at Halona and at Hawikku, and he was serving as the guardian minister for both missions at that time, because there was only one missionary available for all of the Zuni missions. So it was usually just one. And then the question of how many indigenous residents were in the mission is a bit more complicated, because there aren't precise records, but more kind of allusions in various different colonial documents. One accused the friars of using as many as 80 native peoples in the mission, which, if you figure a typical Pueblo in the period was maybe 600 to 1,000 residents, that's a substantial part of the labor force that would be absorbed by a single mission. Probably the number in practice was lower than that, probably around 20 or so people, some of whom resided in the mission, slept there at night, worked there all day, others who came to the mission in daily cycles or weekly cycles to do particular tasks.
Here's a question from Amy Schiffer. Is there any evidence that the Pueblo practices, etc., at Hawikku extended at all to missionaries outside of the mission area?
So I'm not totally sure how to interpret that question.
Maybe Amy can elaborate in a second comment if you'd like. Why don't we come back to that?
Okay.
Hopefully, Amy, if you're listening, could you elaborate exactly what you meant there? So, in other words, what the question? Do you mean extending beyond the mission territory to other native peoples, or to further out into Zuni territory? Or I'm not sure. Amy, if you could elaborate, we'll come back to that. Clint, we have another question here from Marie Fair. As a dinnerware collector and seller, I just want to express my appreciation of your analysis of the materials, forms, and decoration. I guess that's a comment, not a question.
Thank you.
An anonymous question. I'd like to hear more about the divergence between ritual and, quote, hybrid items. So could you speak a little more about the divergence between ritual and hybrid items?
Yeah, I saw that question pop up. To clarify a little bit, I don't mean that there was a divergence between ritual items and hybrid items as if they were two separate things. I think that in many cases, the ritual items were created out of cultural hybridity. And so where I use divergence is that there are divergences in meaning depending upon the audience, the individual who might be perceiving it and interpreting it. And so looking at the Salt Cellar, for example, or soup plates, that's another example I use. To a Spanish person, to a friar sitting at the head of the dinner table in the mission refectory, seeing the mission household members eating off of hybrid soup plates communicated acculturation, that they were no longer eating on the floor in the quote unquote Indian manner that some of the friars talked about, but that they were participating in the meal in a Euro-American Spanish style. But my point is that looking at the iconography of those soup plates, and particularly San Bernardo wares, there's a whole complex of other meanings that those individual diners might have been perceiving as they use those dinnerwares and as they experience them. So the divergence is in the minds of the beholders and how they interpreted these various different items. Another example that I didn't use in my talk today, but that I could point to, when I was working in Smithsonian collections, there were a couple of different artifacts, one from Hawikku and one from the neighboring community of Quechabawa, which has a visita chapel. It's not a permanent convento. The friar didn't live there. He would come and visit and administer the sacraments and then leave. And that chapel is still there. The remains are still partly standing. And looking through the artifacts at Smithsonian, there were two large stone slabs that came from the two sites. And they were face down on the shelves, and we pulled them out. And when you flip them over, each of them had petroglyphs on them. And one of them had the letters INRI, which stand for Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, but carved on the stone as a petroglyph. So using a stone hammer to peck them into the stone in a traditional Pueblo manner. The other one was a sandstone slab that was covered with abstract circles and swirls and marks, such as you might find on cliffs and boulders throughout the Southwest as on-site rock art and petroglyphs. The petroglyph had been incorporated into the wall of the Visita Chapel at Quechabawa in a way that was really plainly visible. And I was able to document that by looking at early photographs of the site. Whereas the INRI was probably the base of a standing cross in one of the plazas at Hawikku. And so these are both cases where the built environment of the Franciscan missions incorporated an indigenous artistic practice of petroglyphs. And I've argued elsewhere in a recent book chapter that these also would be things that could be interpreted in divergent ways. So by incorporating petroglyphs into the built fabric of missions and their environment, for friars, they might perceive this as incorporating the indigenous past into what is now, in their minds, a converted Pueblo and congregation. Whereas talking to Zuni elders and leaders today, they look at those items and suspect that that was a way of the Zuni people being able to preserve traces of their past in a visible way to remind them of who they were, and as a subtle form of resistance to colonization and acculturation.
Right. No, yeah, exactly. It's, again, you get multiple meanings out of one simple object, radically perhaps.
Yeah.
The anthropologist Leslie White long ago summarized that dynamic by saying, chemically speaking, there's no difference between distilled water and holy water, but in terms of what that water means can be radically different in different contexts. So this is a longstanding question of meaning, and that the way that meaning descends upon an object. Let's see, here's a question from Michael Brown. Do we know the fate of the Mexican native people who chose and were apparently allowed to remain at Zuni? Did they become important intercultural brokers? Were they eventually absorbed into Zuni social life? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Before I answer that, I notice we've lost a few participants, and I do want to say something before I answer that.
Please, yeah.
My next research project is looking at 17th century pre-revolt woodwork. And so I'm looking for vigas and corbels and artifacts that came from Spanish missions that have then been collected by many folks here in Santa Fe and elsewhere in New Mexico. So if anybody is listening and is aware of these, has collected them, has contacts who they know have them, please reach out to me individually, because a big part of this project is just tracing down all of those surviving remnants. So thank you. Okay, to the question of what happened to the indigenous allies that came with Coronado and that initial 1540 expedition, there are traces of them in the documentary record. And I think this is a really fascinating story and something that I write about in first in my dissertation and now in what I'm writing here at SAR. When Coronado came, he had about 300 armed Spanish soldiers with him and about 1,300 or so indigenous Mexican allies. These are people from Coyoacan, from Tlaxcala, from different cities in central Mexico who had allied with the Spanish and who were part of that expedition. When Coronado retreated back to what is today Mexico 2 years later, he passed back through Hawikku. And the record suggests that the Zuni people followed for a day or two, trying to both pick up things that they left behind and to attract some of those indigenous allies to stay with them. And I think you have to remember that when he had attacked Hawikku initially, about 60-some Zuni people died in that attack. And that was about 10% of the population at the time. It was a significant part of the Pueblo, so there was a need for people. And I think for some of these indigenous allies, the opportunity to live outside, get out from under the thumb of the Spanish was also an enticing possibility. They could join the Zuni communities and stay and not have to deal with the church, not have to deal with the Spanish, for a generation, basically. Later in the 1580s, there are other Spanish who visited the Zuni Pueblos, talk about having met these Indians who stayed behind, having talked with them. And they were key kind of intermediaries for Spanish who were visiting the Zuni Pueblos. They were the ones, they were kind of the translators and the go-tos for Spanish expeditions. Even when Oñate came in 1598, the children of those indigenous allies were still living at Zuni, still using some Nahuatl words, and were still kind of the key people that they went to. One of the features of Zuni history, as you kind of look through what remains in the documents, is that there are recurrent appearances of what appear to be perhaps a minority within the community, but a faction within the community that saw good reason to ally with the Spanish, whether it be in order to obtain livestock or seeds or tools, what have you. They saw value in that. And there's this recurrent existence of a what I call a pro-Spanish faction throughout the history at Zuni. And we might hypothesize, although it's impossible to prove, that those indigenous allies from Mexico were perhaps the core of that group, that faction within Zuni history.
A quick comment here from Denny Seymour that Esteban was a freed slave when he went north. When you mentioned he was the first person killed by the Zunis. Let's see. Can you say more about the role or known role of women within the Pueblo revolt?
So first of all, thank you, Denny, for your comment. And I know she's working on some important sites for Coronados and Frada in southern Arizona. To the question of women in the Pueblo revolt, my research really doesn't go, I don't really work on the revolt period per se. I'm much more interested in kind of what happened before that. And in understanding kind of those daily interactions.
Okay.
So I probably am not the best qualified person to speak to what the historic records say on women involved in the revolt. I would expect, just from my knowledge and experience in Pueblo culture, that women play an important role in most things in Pueblos. And I can't imagine that the revolt happened without involvement of clan mothers and women within the communities.
Okay. Here's a question from Betty Atkins. History is written by victors. How much does this influence the storytelling about history?
Yeah, I mean, I think that calls attention to the core issue that history is a story, that it's told from particular viewpoints, and it seeks to respond to the rhetorical needs of those tellers. So clearly the histories that have been told about colonial New Mexico have been written predominantly by either people writing from a Spanish perspective, or by Anglos who moved into the region following the invasion by the United States in 1846, 1847. And so, yeah, it's always been written from those perspectives. I think it's complicated because mission history has been viewed from an Anglo perspective, often through the lens of what's known as the Black Legend, this idea of that focuses on Spanish atrocities, which really began as a PR tactic by the competition, so to speak, in English colonizers. But that isn't to say that the violence and genocide wasn't also a part of many Spanish actions in New Mexico. I'm hoping that by working in a more interdisciplinary fashion to draw on archaeological data and work with descendant community members to have a more well-rounded perspective in the writing of history myself, but it's finding the perspective is always a challenge.
Yeah, this is something that historians of the Caribbean are always wrestling with, and of course that's my regional specialty. But the idea that colonial archives are always produced, the archives themselves are produced by and for a particular, plantation elite, is a similar kind of problem, and you really can never escape that problem fully, because you'd have the same thing here. Your written records are by and for a Spanish colonizing force, and so how do you have to get creative about working around that, and I think interdisciplinarity is part of the way to do that. But it's an intractable problem at a certain level.
And I think a lot of the things that I'm really interested in, kind of those daily interactions within the convento, are things that, generally speaking, Spanish chroniclers and documents don't want to talk about. And they were either because it was so everyday and ordinary that it didn't deserve mention, or because it didn't necessarily meet with metropolitan expectations for what religious life should be. For either reason, they tend to obscure it. And so a lot of my research has involved kind of looking for the tossed off line in the midst of other documents that are not really about convento life at all, but from which we can then kind of discern a little bit of information.
Silencing the past, trying to unsilence the past. Okay, let's see. There are a few questions here from your fellows this year, and I might jump over those for the moment in case we run out of time, since we can have an ongoing conversation. I apologize the other fellows for that. And we'll come back if we have the steam left. But let me jump ahead to folks who aren't here and can't have that in-person conversation. Ellen Bradbury Reed has a question. The use of salt is interesting. We know Zunis use Zuni salt to bless a new house at Shalako. The old salt woman is the mother of the twin war gods who live in a supersaturated red pool in one of the cinder cones at Zuni Salt Lake, which is red and salt like blood. Can you meditate on the importance of salt to the Zunis, which also connects, maybe not exactly, with the European importance of salt?
I can definitely meditate on that. To comment more on it, I mean, I think it's striking that the most kind of intricate artifact that was recovered from Hawikku is the Salt Cellar. It was recovered it's not in pristine condition, but it's in very good condition. It's a really unique item that was initially misunderstood. It was interpreted as a chalice and had been stored upside down for almost 100 years in First Museum of American Indian and NMAI collections, because it was thought that it was a cup and that the base was where the wine would go. And so this is the first time that it's really gotten sustained attention and focus that it merits. I find it striking that salt is such a potent symbolic substance, and it is connected to divinity in both traditions. And in many ways, I feel like it's similar to the atrial crosses in Mexico. These are, for those unfamiliar with Latin American art history, these are stone crosses that were raised in the courtyard of missions all throughout central Mexico. In the center of the courtyard, they often have sculptural ornamentation on them. And so they represent the death of Christ and the accumulation of objects of the Passion, but they also very eloquently speak to Mesoamerican cosmology, which is quincunxial in shape, very much like Zuni understandings of the cosmos, with four directions around a center point, and the belief in a central world tree that connects all of the levels together. And so for Christians, of course, the cross was the sacrificial tree that connected heaven and earth, that reconciled human beings to God and allowed for that relationship to exist. And for Mesoamericans, it was the avenue by which contact with the different levels of the cosmos was possible. And it was intimately connected to sacrifice as well. And so I think there's a profound connection between worldviews that is fascinating, and is much of what got me into this area of research, because trying to contemplate how that synthesis was arrived at, how those connections were made and understood is really, to me, mind-boggling. And I see a similar connection in the understanding of salt and its connection to superhuman or super person or divine beings in both Zuni and European tradition. And I think that that's a part of why so much energy was exerted in making this vessel and its complex connections between cultures.
Clint, here's a question from Vincent La Rosa. At the beginning of your talk, you created a tension between two different tellings of the story of the death of Padre Pedro. First version, he was dragged from the altar of the Virgin Mary and killed with the bronze bell of the convent. In the second version, he was killed running from the convent. What are the implications of this tension on the responsibility inherent in storytelling and on our understanding of the vested interests in this story and in general, the story in general? Thank you. So what are the implications? Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. And I would add that there's the additional tension of him trying to frame his own death as a martyr, which in some ways I think gets woven back into the story, because as later Spanish chroniclers and Franciscans told this story, he again becomes something martyr-like in that retelling. So the implications of this tension, I mean, I think it points to the embeddedness of each of us as tellers in the story. The tension with him running from the convento, being killed in that case, that comes from Zuni oral history and Nicolita Witsalusi's story of the priest running and being caught and thrown down from the rooftop of the convento or the church. And there are very different tellings. Like I said, they can potentially be understood in ways that are not contradictory. I don't think that it necessarily means that one is untrue in its reflection of the lived past. But there are very different occasions for telling, and I think that Witsalusi marginalizes the priest and makes his is like the beginning line of the story, and then it goes on from there, and that's all you hear of the priest, and that's all that he matters from that perspective. Whereas from the perspective of later Franciscan chroniclers who were hoping to construct a martyrology and to justify colonization, you know, the story of Pedro de Ayala is really central to that story, and he becomes a fixation in it. So it really calls attention to our role as storytellers and how we are reflected in the stories that we tell. And figuring out how to balance that is tough, and that's something I'm wrestling with right now in my writing, is how much of myself do I put explicitly into the story, and how do I be honest about my role as the teller, while also maintaining a focus on things that I think are really interesting.
Clint, here's a question from Tamara Bray. In your study of the collections at NMAI and NMNH, are there also locally produced ceramic vessels that exhibit traditional Christian iconography, in addition to the examples you showed with Puebloan imagery?
Ceramic vessels that exhibit traditional Christian iconography. By which I think, if I understand the question right, she's asking if there are these examples of hybrid ceramics that were produced locally amongst the Pueblos that have iconography that would be understood as traditional to Christianity or to Euro-American Christianity. Mm-hmm. Certainly there are plenty with crosses on them, and that's, you know, but I don't think that that's a simple icon. Like, I don't know that a cross can represent certainly the crucifixion of Jesus in the Christian religion. It can also represent the four directions. It can also represent a dragonfly, and in some representations, it can represent roadrunner tracks, which have an X-shaped foot, or X-shaped tracks. So even when you see something that appears to be conventionally Christian, a simple and iconic cross, it can have multiple meanings depending upon who's looking at it and who's interpreting it. There are other examples of things like there's a Flurry Cross, which a Flurry Cross is a cross that has a fleur-de-lis at each of the finials. And fleur-de-lis were symbols of royalty, but they were also adopted by the Franciscans as an important symbol of the order. You see fleur-de-lis in many Franciscan missions. In the Pueblos, though, the fleur-de-lis becomes transformed into an ear of corn or a corn plant. And so there's examples of San Bernardo where they have two fleur-de-lis stacked up on each other in such a way that they look like a corn plant that's growing and has an ear of corn at the top. Without going into too much detail, amongst the Hopi where San Bernardo wares were produced, indigenous altars would involve 6 ears of corn laid out on the floor around a center point. and those represent the four terrestrial directions and the access to heaven, to the skies above and the underworld below. And in the example of the Flurry Cross from San Bernardo, you have four fleur-de-lis ears of corn around a grid in the center. And that grid, when you see in San Bernardo wares or Hopi pottery in general, when you see a grid with dots in the center of each square, that represents corn. So you have four directional ears of corn and you have corn at the center as well. And so it's taking a traditional Spanish Christian icon, the Flurry Cross, and turning it into what could be seen as a representation of a Pueblo altar. So it's, I don't think that there's any simple icons. Everything has multiple meanings.
The irreducible polyvalence of things.
Exactly.
And of their meanings.
Exactly.
That was a lovely question, and it's a lovely answer, even if it may not be conclusive.
Exactly.
Juliana Fagua Arias has a question. Thanks so much for this talk. Could you elaborate on the trade routes that connected the Haiwaku mission to larger trade networks, for example, with Mexico, or the larger transatlantic or trans-Pacific trade?
For sure. First of all, it's important to say that Hawikku sat on what were a number of indigenous trade routes that had existed for millennia. The trade of shell from the West Coast and from the Gulf of California came through Hawikku. The trade of things like turquoise was really important. There were also trade in things like macaws and other indigenous materials, and a lot of that passed through Hawikku, which was connected to what is now southern Arizona and northern Mexico. Hawikku also existed at the far extension of the Spanish trade routes and the global trade in the early modern period. Anything that was imported and brought to Hawikku came from Mexico City up the Camino Real through El Paso del Norte, today's Ciudad Juarez, and all the way to Santa Fe and Santo Domingo, where it was then distributed to the different missions. And so that connected Hawikku in a rather indirect way to global markets, both in Europe and in Asia. So Mexico City was, of course, connected to Europe through Spanish ships, but also to the Philippines and the Manila Galleon ships that went between Acapulco and the Philippines. And so among the artifacts that are found at Hawikku are a number of sherds of Chinese Ming Dynasty porcelain, which is a very pure white kale and clay with cobalt blue ornament on it. I'm still doing my analysis of that set of artifacts, so there's probably more to say about it. But it appears to me that primarily what was imported from China were small little teacups that maybe didn't have handles, but they were just a teacup shape that were probably used for drinking hot chocolate that was brought up from Mexico. And it remained an important ritual of Spanish society in colonial New Mexico.
Clint, we've gone way over time. However, there are three good questions here. One elaboration from our earlier question from Amy, and then questions from two of the other fellows. If you have time, and folks who need to leave, please feel free. I understand we're going over, but if you're still game, could we go through those three last questions? Or
oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Terrific. Well, let me take up our Adriana Leonardes Palma's question. She writes, thanks for your presentation, Clint. I'm curious about what you say at the beginning of your talk about collaboration. Could you expand a little more about how was that collaboration?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really important part of ethical scholarship today, to be engaged with descendant communities, the people who really have the highest stakes in how these histories are told, and who have a right to exert agency in their telling, because it's their story, their ancestors. For me individually, that has been especially focused on working collaboratively in Zuni, although I've also done work in other Pueblos and worked with, as I mentioned, potters from Hopi, for example. And I think of collaboration as a process. I think that it's based on trust and building trust between community members and outside researchers such as myself. And so often it takes time to kind of build a relationship before you can enter into something that's a truly collaborative project. And by what I mean by collaboration, in the ideal form, a collaborative project is one in which all of the participants work together to develop the project initially, to determine its goals and objectives, who then are equally invested in the process of the research and in doing the work and mutually benefit from it. And so this is a very different model of scholarship than the traditional Western academic model, in which the outside researcher comes up with a problem, comes up with a question, they come to the community, seek data to answer it, and then they leave and write their book and publish it, and nobody ever hears of them again. So this kind of helicopter scholarship is a real problem because it doesn't build trust, because it is basically a form of colonization or extraction of resources. It's just that the resource is information and knowledge. And it allows a scholar to build a career without ever giving anything back in return for that. And so for me personally, it's very important to be invested in a community where people know me, where I come around regularly, where I am given critical feedback and told if I'm wrong, and we can adapt and adjust my work to meet those needs. It's important that my work also give back. So one of the things that I do is grant writing, and I've helped raise funds and help support community institutions as much as I'm able to as an outsider. And so it's important to me to maintain those relationships and continue that work as long as I'm welcome there. So that's my collaborative ideal, and that's what I strive for. And with something that started as a dissertation, it started out as kind of conventional academic work where I came up with a problem and question and came to the community seeking consultation. But since then, it has been possible to build other projects in a more collaborative mode and to continue building those relationships. So, and I know I have some Zuni listeners today and some folks who are going to tune in. So I just want to say thank you so much for all of the grace and hospitality that you've shown me in this process, and also in your patience with me as I learn.
There's a question here that overlaps a little, a question from Benjamin Young, and it's a great question. Folks can read it, read the full question, but you've already answered parts of it. But there's a kernel here that I don't think you've addressed directly. Let me try to extract that. We usually understand storytelling as a social and interactive process, which implies that anticipation of the audience's reaction influences the construction or unfolding of the story. With that in mind, what audiences are you contemplating as you assemble these stories from your research?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And it calls attention to the point that one of the primary audiences that I anticipate are members of the Zuni community, to whom I return research, to whom I come back to and discuss these questions in ongoing relationships. As I take my dissertation, which was a rather large project, ended up being over 1,000 pages, I'm thinking about how do I convert that into something that will be accessible to an interested general reader. Because I think many of the folks that I have met and known in Zuni, but also other Pueblo communities, are very interested in this history. And so they may not necessarily be trained in art history or trained in anthropology, but they have a broad basis of knowledge about this history and relating to it. And so as I write, that's the kind of audience that I want to keep in mind and avoid kind of using some of the academic jargon and the kind of inscrutable ways of writing that we as academics tend to fall into over time, but rather to think about an audience that, yes, includes a general readership, yes, includes academics, but the audience that I feel probably the greatest responsibility to are those community members who I will share my work with and hope will find interesting and read it. One other thing that I will mention, and this is just something that is still in development, and we're still kind of working out how to do this, is I think it's important that there be an element of community review to whatever I write. And so sometimes that has involved co-authoring things. I have things that are in press now that are co-authored with community partners. But also sometimes that just means bringing the draft back to collaborators there in the community and getting their feedback, talking over it, making sure that my language accurately reflects their understanding, and that it's a truthful representation. And how we're going to do that in the larger book project remains to be seen, but it's something that I'm working on now.
Okay, and then finally, again, Ben had more, but I think you'd already really covered that. So to go back to Amy Schiffer, she did elaborate what she meant in her original question, which again, her first question, let me go back to here, was, is there evidence that Pueblo practices at Haiwaku extended at all to missionaries outside the mission area? And what here she elaborates, you had mentioned that the Pueblo practices were entangled with Spanish culture, and I wondered if they extended to any missionaries beyond Haiwaku rather than just within, basically wondering whether it was a two-way street.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I was a bit confused by the question initially is there are a number of different examples of Franciscan missionaries in particular, but other mendicants as well, adapting and adjusting and incorporating aspects of indigenous cultures as part of their evangelization efforts and as part of Spanish life in different places. Although it tends to be kind of regionally specific and culturally specific. So the way those adaptations worked in Spanish Florida are different than in New Mexico, or in 16th century central Mexico is different than in New Mexico. But there are a number of different ways in which missionaries explored that kind of hybridity or were open to it at various different times. I think if I understand the question now, she's also asking, did Pueblo influences flow back into Spanish culture more generally? Mm-hmm. And I think that it's a difficult question, and I'm not, like, if we were to put it in the abstract, do we start seeing prayer sticks showing up in Mexico City in the late 17th century? No, I don't think so. It wasn't like that. But there might be some examples that could be explored. One of the areas that I'm interested right now in doing primary research on is colonial woodworking in New Mexico, as I mentioned. And initially with missionization, the Spanish brought in carpenters who then taught Spanish techniques of woodworking to Pueblo artisans. And most famously, Pecos Pueblo was known for its carpenters throughout up to the Pueblo Revolt, but even throughout the 18th century, Pecos carpenters were contracted in other pueblos to come do work. And one theory that I haven't yet to been able to kind of explore and confirm is that a lot of woodworking in northern Mexico and what is today Chihuahua and Sonora might have been influenced by or even executed by New Mexico carpenters. This is something that has been put forth by Sarah Bargellini, and it's something that I'm interested in exploring further as I look at woodworking. My focus is going to be on the period from about the 1620s until the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, but one of the questions then arises, well, what happened to New Mexico carpentry after the Pueblo Revolt? And I think that to really explore that question, you have to look at both post-revolt New Mexico, examples like San Miguel here in Santa Fe, but also northern Mexico and the similarly styled carpentry that begins to appear in Chihuahua and elsewhere. So that's a question I would love to explore if there was kind of a flow back into Mexico from Pueblo artisans, but I can't answer it in the affirmative now.
Fantastic. Well, and finally, there are a couple of comments, one of which Laurel has already answered, but another comment from Sally Haskey saying thank you for your discussion, the discussion of your research, Clint. Looking forward to seeing and hearing more of your research. And I think that's a great comment to end with, because I think it speaks for many of us. So Clint, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Thank you everyone for listening in. Again, check out the SAR calendar. It's on the upper right corner of our homepage, our website, sarweb.org. And with that, I will log off. Folks, take care and see you next time.